I think a lot of cosmopolitan elites, if I would put myself in there, I think we tend to think of ourselves as very not tribal. We are open-minded, the most tolerant people, and what I've written about is how a lot of cosmopolitan elites don't realize just how insular and snobby they are.
Amy Chua, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you so much, Alistair. It's so much fun to be here.
Great. So you've argued that Americans underestimate the power of ethnic and cultural identities. Could you say a bit about what led you to make that argument?
I think everything is autobiographical. I kind of did start off with that idea. I actually went to law school and I teach at a law school. But what I've kind of been writing about for the last, honestly, 25 years is the power of ethnic identity and, more broadly, the power of just group identity of any kind. And so in my book 2018 called Political Tribes, I argued that all of the United States' absolute worst foreign policy disasters have been the result, or at least for the last 50 years, have been the result of the failure to understand the kind of particular ethnic and tribal identities that operate on the ground. America tends to be very idealistic, where it's the battle between capitalism and communism, or, democracy and the axis of evil. And what I argue is there's a lot of, the reason people will kill and what they will die for has a lot to do with the groups that they were born into.
I see. Can you give some examples of cases in foreign policy where the US has made this kind of mistake?
Yeah, so starting actually with Vietnam, we, even to this day, think of it as, well, it was a terrible failed war. We were in there and we lost. And it was viewed as it's so important to intervene and win this, because if Vietnam falls and becomes communist, then there's going to be the domino effect. So again, this was, we are the capitalists, we're going to save the people. What they didn't realize is two things. First, that Vietnam has been colonized for most of its long history. First and foremost by China, the really great enemy, and then by the French, and then by the, it went on and on. So the desire for independence was something that was foremost. A lot of people know that now. What they don't know, even historians of the era, they don't realize that Vietnam have what I call a market-dominant minority. And this is a tiny ethnic minority that basically controls the economy. I'm not talking about stereotypes. They actually control the economy. So in Vietnam, for hundreds of years, there was a tiny ethnic Chinese minority, only about 1% of the population, known as the Hoa. And I think for a lot of Westerners, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, they're all the same, but it was not the same for the Vietnamese. So the importance of this is that, for example, Saigon, the entire finance sector, the rice sector, the entire manufacturing center, all the banks, all of the wealth, everything associated with capitalism was actually controlled by this ethnic Chinese, who were hated by the majority Vietnamese because they were viewed as snobby, they didn't intermarry with the Vietnamese, they didn't fight in the war, they had their own schools, their own language. So when the Americans came in and said, we are bringing in capitalism, they kind of missed this ethnic dimension, and all of the people that they benefited, the networks they used, the retail people, the middlemen, were all Chinese. So this actually contributed later. The North Vietnamese, they actually used this rhetoric. They said, the Chinese control 100% of everything. If you put in capitalism, guess who's going to benefit? So that's just an example of what I think, people were like, how does the United States, the most powerful country in the world, lose to Vietnam, that was just tiny with barely any weapons? And there's been a lot of talk about, they had guerrilla warfare, but this is how the United States lost the battle for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, by missing this ethnic and kind of tribal aspect of it.
I see. And would you give a similar diagnosis of failures in Afghanistan?
Oh, yeah.
Iraq?
Afghanistan is actually now, I think people have focused on this there. Again, we just said, okay, we are going to take out fundamentalism. So that's what they saw. It's the good guys against Islamic fundamentalism. Once again, they didn't realize that Afghanistan is a complicated patchwork of ethnic, tribal, religious, it's not just this one divide. And to make a long story short, the Pashtuns are a very significant and, a group of people that actually view Afghanistan as really their country. Yeah. But they're also Tajiks and Uzbeks, and it's a very different dynamic, a real mosaic. But that's what we missed in this case, that the Taliban are not just a fundamentalist group, but they're also arguably, first and foremost, an ethnic Pashtun group. So missing this, people are like, oh my God, everyone's going to hate the Taliban. But instead, once again, many of our policies that we implemented once the United States went in there benefited the enemies of the Pashtuns, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks. They put them in the transitional government and kind of wondered why things weren't taking. Why would anybody support the Taliban? And that was the piece of it that was missing.
I see. And do you think that the US there are still ongoing foreign policy engagements that America has where it's making the same mistake?
I wrote a lot, and sadly in my 2003 book, World on Fire, correctly predicted exactly what happened in Iraq. I said, this is before we went in, I said, you know what, I know everybody thinks we're going to bring democracy, but again, Iraq had a market-dominant minority, in this case, the 14% Sunnis. And this was a group that had, kind of held power first under the Ottomans, when the Ottomans were Sunni power. Then the British came along, and they loved to divide and conquer, favored this minority. And then Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. And what I said was, if you suddenly introduce overnight democracy in these circumstances, what will happen is not peace and prosperity, but you're going to get demagogues. You're going to get fundamentalists that said, it's our turn. Vote me in. It's time for revenge. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah. It gave rise to these fundamentalist movements. Maliki was a Shia, 80%, and basically embarked on a campaign of revenge. And then the Sunnis, suddenly they're like, wait, this democracy thing is not working out for us, as this hated minority. And many of them joined, insurrectionists. That they joined Al-Qaeda and later ISIS, which was a Sunni movement. Today, our biggest battles right now are, there's the Ukraine war, and I don't think that's the same. There's not always an ethnic dimension. There obviously is one here, but I think it's a little bit hard to miss, the Ukrainian versus Russian one. So I don't think there's an ethnic market-dominant minority there. And the Middle East is the other big, a huge nightmare for the United States. And so I don't think at this particular moment that's the biggest problem. But in both cases, you do see the kind of impact of my larger thesis, which is these are long, standing historical, enmities. I'm not saying they're genetic or that they're not replaceable or not, sort of overcomeable, but you do see right now a return to these age-old conflicts. They're not like out of nowhere.
It seems surprising that for a nation of immigrants that, like the US is, that it would make this kind of mistake. Why do you think the US does make this kind of mistake? Great
question. See, I would flip it. I think it's precisely because the United States has had such a remarkable, it's weird to say success record, because with our African Americans, it's the biggest failure, but with the exception of certain large and very, very important minority groups, Native Americans, we conducted pretty much genocide, and African Americans, where we had slavery for much longer than really almost any other country except for Brazil. But apart from these big cases that we all know about, when the immigrants first came to the United States, they weren't just from England and Holland, they were from France and Scandinavia and Germany and Italy, and then later there were waves of Romanians and Hungarians and Poles and Jews, and in the United States, the story over and over has been successful assimilation within about 2 generations, sometimes just 1. So most of my friends, a lot of people in the United States are, oh, part Irish, part German, part Dutch, part Chinese, or, I'm part Mexican, part. So I actually think in some ways it's our, the somewhat idiosyncratic fact that our identity, the American, is, on a good day, ideally, an ethnically neutral national identity, rooted in ideas. If you believe you're willing to comply with the principles of the U.S. Constitution, you can be an American. It's not as simple as that. Practice says it's not. But in general, at least in theory, that's been how you can be an American. And for just many, many generations of immigrants, that's really happened. Including my own parents who were immigrants from Asia. But now they have a Greek son-in-law, a Jewish son-in-law. So I think in some ways. It was the unusual history of America, a lot of intermixing and a lot of this hybrid stuff kind of, creating this new American that made people think, hey, we're going to go into, Iraq and Sunni, Shias, Kurds, let's just put in markets and everybody will be a consumer and that will melt away all these divisions. And, my message was just that it's not so easy. Yeah,
I see. Do you think that the US is unusually preoccupied with ideologies then?
It's a good question. I'm not a comparative historian, but I do think there is something about the youth of our country and, recently we're now really confronting slavery and, the Native American experience. But really for most of Americans' history, the way I learned history, was all pretty positive. Great Britain has to deal with, there was imperialism and all these things. And but in the United States, it was always the story of, we fought this Revolutionary War and we had the 4th of July and the Statue of Liberty and we stand for mostly democracy, but it's really been kind of capitalism and democracy. We have the most free-willing system of markets. And democracy, we haven't had the kinds of problems that I study, which is, I've written about democracy in countries like Zimbabwe or Indonesia or Venezuela, where not always corrupt elections, sometimes free and fair, roughly free and fair elections, give rise to an ethno-nationalist leader, a demagogue, a populist. And we have been relatively free of that in the United States. So I think that we are, or historically have been, a very unusually, it's nice too, but a little bit naive and idealistic, and maybe a little bit US-centric, thinking that what worked in the United States is going to work elsewhere. And I kind of think like right now what the United States is going through is a kind of a period of reckoning. Like as you know, in 2016, Democratic elections brought to power President Donald Trump, which a lot of people are very upset about that. It's certainly at universities where I teach, and the first move was exactly the same move as in Venezuela, which is he can't really have been elected. It's got to have been the Russians. It's got to be corrupt. It's got to be something. But I think it's this kind of realizing that in a lot of places around the world, democracy combined with various ethnic, tribal, class dynamics doesn't always produce ideal outcomes.
Right, yeah. And so do you think that there is a sense in which there is still a lot of tribalism present in the US, despite this integration that you've been talking about? Yeah.
So, there's a whole range of tribalism. Some it's just it's nice, like kind of cultural affiliations. Again, at its best, the United States is a place where you can be Italian American or Mexican American or Lebanese American or Egyptian American or Japanese American and still be very patriotic at the same time. We have this big umbrella and we allow a lot of ethnic flourishing. We're so proud of our Chinatown and Italytown and Nepaltown, Koreatown. But yes, right now we, in addition to our most difficult ethnic problem, which is it's always been started with slavery. That continues to be a problem. We have a kind of a new division right now that I've written about. I've actually written about the possible emergence in the United States for the first time in our 200-year history of our own weird little idiosyncratic version of a market-dominant minority. Now, it's not ethnic. It's not like the Chinese, it's because we're a nation of immigrants. But I'm actually referring to what we might call cosmopolitan elites or coastal elites. And it's a very stark divide, where I teach at Yale Law School or Stanford or NYU or UCLA or all the major cities. It doesn't have to be coastal. It could be in Chicago or Atlanta. People just cannot understand how anybody could have voted for Donald Trump. And to answer your question, I think a lot of cosmopolitan elites, if I would put myself in there, these are all my, I think we tend to think of ourselves as very not tribal. We are open-minded, the most tolerant people, and what I've written about is how a lot of cosmopolitan elites don't realize just how insular and snobby they are. And if you look at the statistics, the division now between kind of cosmopolitan elite whites and the more blue-collar, working-class, rural whites who form Donald Trump's base, the difference between these two groups of whites is now so deep that it's almost like an ethnic difference. Wearing my more political science sociology hat, what is an ethnic difference? Very hard to, I spent pages, describing this, but one interesting marker is the rate of intermarriage. Usually if there's intermarriage, then that ethnic division will go away. There is so little interaction and intermarriage between these two groups of whites that in that sense, it's like an ethnic division. It is so much more common for a white coastal elite, one of my students, to marry someone of Indian descent or Pakistan descent or Afghanistan descent or Japanese descent or Korean descent of comparable educational status than it is for that person to marry somebody from Appalachia, the South. I've just been to 8 weddings this year. It's all been like that, So I think, once again, there's a kind of blindness to the intensity of certain group identities. In this particular case, it's not straight up ethnic, like, black and white or Chinese versus Indonesian, but I still think it's a certain kind of blindness.
Yeah. And I believe that you yourself are the daughter of immigrants.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about how your own life led you to be interested in these kinds of topics.
Well, I'm excited to be talking about this at Hey on Why. My first little just kind of solo talk is about being an outsider. And when I was little, back then there were almost no Asians in the United States. It's changed a lot in the last several decades. So we grew up in the Midwest, and we were the only Asian people in the whole school, in the whole neighborhood, and we really stuck out. We had a Chinese accent. My mom cut my hair. We looked so funny. And what I realized is, it started off as a little bit hard. Like we felt like people from outer space. But I believe it was just a great giant blessing in disguise, because if I now look at every single book I've written, in some ways I think it benefited. I benefited from having an outsider perspective. So my first book, World on Fire, a foreign policy book, I coined this term market dominant minority. And when my mom first read the book, she's like, wait, you're writing about the Chinese minorities of Southeast Asia and how they're wealthy? Everyone knows this. But she was wrong. I knew it because my parents are Chinese from the Philippines. So we were very aware of it. But Thomas Friedman was very nice to me. He said, I never knew of this dynamic before. And even my notorious Tiger Mom book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, generated a lot of, I think, ultimately really fruitful and interesting debate about parenting all over the world. The funny thing is that was rooted in a misunderstanding. I wasn't really trying to write a how-to guide. My younger daughter just rebelled against my strict parenting, so I thought I was going to lose her, and I wrote this memoir. But that, too, reflected an outsider's perspective. I was essentially trying to raise my 2 children the same way that my immigrant Chinese parents raised me, And basically, Alistair, I realized I couldn't replicate that experience because I was not a poor immigrant. My oldest daughter has a great line. She'd say, "Mommy, it's not my fault that I'm not a poor immigrant's kid." Because my dad wore the same pair of shoes for 15 years. I mean, we had no money. So when he said, you need to get straight A's, perfect grades, I got it. But I think once one generation, you don't have to get rich, but you rise a little bit so you're more comfortable. It's very hard to do the same, have the same expectations with the next generation. So that was, again, an outsider perspective. And I just talked about political tribes. I think being an outsider has made me very perceptive to group differences, maybe too perceptive to a fault. I just see difference where other people might not. And this last thing I did was a novel called The Golden Gate. It's a historical fiction, and it's situated in the San Francisco Bay Area right in 1944. And again, it's a relief to not be talking about politics and all these toxic issues, but everybody who's read the book says, oh my God, this reflects this outsider, because I'm so interested in the parallels between 2024 and actually 1944, where you saw the Japanese internment. Right before that, 20 years before, there was a mass deportation of Mexicans, like over 1 million people. And then as now, a lot of Asians, all Asians were like, they might be spies. And we can't tell the difference between Chinese and Japanese. They all might be spies. And we see a little bit of this in the United States right now with the rise of China as a big threat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.